As you probably saw from the title of this video, today I'll be talking about my testimony and how Jesus, met me where I was and kind of saved my life in a sense. And for those that, don't know me, I know some people that are watching this do know me. My name's Levi. And I'm a follower of Christ. I believe that Jesus is, my Lord and Savior, and that He died on the cross for the sins of the world. I also make content on social media, and I also make music as well. Yeah, that's basically who I am. But anyways, today I will be going over my testimony basically and how I found my faith in Christ. So all the way from the beginning, of my life, I actually grew up in a Christian household. I grew up learning about Jesus and learning about God. I've been going to the same church the same church that I went to as a baby. I've been going there ever since, and I learned, Ten Commandments. I learned things about God, the characteristics, whatnot. I really did believe in God, but the problem is that I actually had a lukewarm relationship with God, and when of course, when back then I believed that I had to work my way to God, and like I had to be all good and everything like that, but I had a lukewarm relationship with God, and the reason why I say lukewarm is because as I started getting older, I realized that I had a craving for lust. When I was growing up, I was exposed to pornography, and over time that became an addiction with me that always stuck to me. I never really told anybody about that back then. It was just kind of like my deep dark secret that I had an addiction to it, and my mind was lustful, and my heart was kind of separate from God, and that's why I say I was in I had a lukewarm relationship with Him, because out in the outside and out in public, if you met me back then, I would be all for Jesus. Like, I'd be like, yeah, you believe in God? That's great. I believe in God too. I don't watch that stuff. I don't do anything. You know what I mean? Like, I would always lie about not having to do with anything about lust, even though deep down inside I knew that I was struggling with it. And so that's kind of how I had my lukewarm relationship with God. But other than that, I did, everybody knew me as, that kind of guy that kind of is friends with everybody, really social, gives advice to everybody. I was kind of known for that because, again, like I said, out in the outside, I seem like this very outgoing person who has nothing to hide, is very honest, and but in reality, I'm not that person. Back then, I wasn't that person. Back then, in deep down secret, I knew that I was lustful, and that I was also prideful as well. But, anyways, when I had that addiction, I was basically giving into it every single time. I tried multiple ways to quit that addiction, and it just never worked. Like, I remember searching up on YouTube how to stop watching how to stop doing that, and it never really worked, because I just ended up kept going back to it, and it never really worked permanently, whatever I did. I even had relationships in middle school year. Actually, I had relationships which I thought relationships in general would help me get rid of that, desire for lust and the desire to go to pornography. um, but again, it didn't work. Not only did I you know not only didn't work, but I ended up hurting other people, and it wasn't good in general. um, and the love that I said I had for those people during those times and the relationships that I had, it honestly wasn't genuine, I believe. Back then, again, like I said, I wasn't in the right mindset, and my heart was away from God, and I was embracing the fleshly desire of lust, and you know I was honestly having intentions, lustful intentions. Wait. I had lustful intentions. I know that a part of me back then definitely was trying to fill, a hole of intimacy in my heart. That's ultimately what I believe. That's what I wanted. I just filled, that hole of intimacy with lust and relationships that, weren't genuine, and, weren't love driven. You know what I mean? Um, so that was middle school, and then, moving on to high school. This is where kind of the actual story starts. Um, First year in high school, I'm a freshman. You know, I'm very excited. I was very excited that I was moving on to the next level of school. Um, I wanted to see all my friends again and everything. Um, and actually, before I went to high school, so this was like during of the break before the start of high school. I was in a relationship and I got my heart broken. Um, I got my heart broken, and that really, I guess, hurt me mentally. I was just so lost. I thought I lost everything. Um, and, to be honest, my heart was still kind of away from God. I was still dealing with those problems, like I said. It actually was a real problem that it was like a deep down secret. I couldn't tell anybody about it. And I kind of just always pushed it to the side in a sense. But I was heartbroken, and that hole in my heart for intimacy was, it was hungry again. It wasn't fulfilled permanently. And so when I lost that person, I was really sad, and I was devastated, and I was questioning my life. I was like, I thought I lost everything, right? So then moving on to the first year of high school, I was in band. I'm still am in band, but I decided to join band freshman year, and I met somebody in a band comp. I met this girl. I knew nothing about her. I didn't know her at all. She was from a different school than I was, but I met this girl, and at the time, I kind of liked this girl. You know what I mean? It was kind of like a love at first sight kind of thing, I guess. But what happened was she came up to me, exchanged information, and from then on, that girl soon became my girlfriend. Um, that relationship at the very start really, really surprised me, because at the time, I was just I really liked this girl. I really did. I thought that she was sweet like no other, and kind, and caring, and everything. But, um, again, as I was still dealing with, the problem of lust and my addiction of pornography, um, and my heart being away from God, it started to really, I guess, affect the relationship. Because what I noticed in the relationship is that I started to lie more. And I kind of been lying my whole life from that point. You know, I kind of been lying about, you know, me not watching that stuff, me not thinking about that stuff, you know, me saying that it's wrong, even though deep down my flesh hungers for that. You know, I was basically lying, but then my lies, you know, they actually turned into real actions, and so I started to lie more. And I noticed this, you know, this really led to, I guess, a situation in where I told a lot of lies, and it broke that girl's heart, you know, that really hurt her. And, you know, I felt really ashamed for lying. Even though I knew that it was wrong, I still did it. And, you know, I never cried so hard because there was this one time where I lied, and, you know, she found out that I lied. And I was begging, basically. I was begging for her not to leave, and begging that I'm sorry and everything like that. And, you know, she started to lose trust in me. Don't mind the dog in the background. I don't know whose dog that is, but she started to lose trust in me, and she started to gain, you know, trust issues and become really insecure, uh, and everything. So everything was just kind of going bad at that point. And then, you know, actually in the relationship, there's this, during a time in the relationship, I actually got baptized again. And to be honest, that baptism didn't really feel like a baptism, you know? I didn't feel any different, you know, before I got baptized. I know it's not the baptism that, you know, saves you and everything, but when I took that baptism, I thought something crazy was gonna happen, or like, you know, everything was gonna be different. But the thing is, you know, after I did the baptism, I still dealt with the same problems. You know, nothing kind of really changed. Sure, I might have, you know, made a testimony. I did make a testimony for that baptism. I made a testimony, and you know, I went through a whole course and everything like that, but I still had the same problem with lust. It was still my deep darkest secret, and I still, you know, did not confess that to anybody, you know? So in reality, I was still ashamed of that, so that's why I never really told anybody about that. And that was just like the one, you know, sin that was kind of, you know, I could never really get rid of. But anyways, yeah, I got baptized. And then moving on from the baptism that I had, something really bad happened. And I'll never forget this moment in my life, because I believe this event, this, you know, point in time of my life was the turning point for when my life was going to change. So what happened was, one day I was hanging out, you know, with my girlfriend, and, you know, she randomly takes my phone. And we gone over this topic before, of like, you know, she asked me, do you, you know, have you ever watched pornography, or do you watch pornography? And obviously, me keeping it as a secret to everybody, obviously I said, you know, I said no. And the worst part is that I even tried to, you know, I even made myself believe that what I was doing, you know, wasn't wrong. You know, I was kind of blinded in a sense by my own lust. Like, you know, I was trying to make myself believe that I'm not that bad, or what I'm doing is not that bad. You know what I mean? But I lied, and I said, no, I don't watch that stuff. I think that stuff's disgusting. I don't watch it. And then I said, like, you know, I used to, but I don't watch it anymore. I'm changed. I just got baptized. Like, I literally use that as an excuse, I'm pretty sure. But, you know, yeah, I lied. And, you know, now moving to back where I was, the day where, you know, she randomly took my phone, and I was like, what are you doing? And she was like, I'm checking something. And, you know, deep down, you know, I'm like, the real me is like, oh no, what if she finds out that, you know, that I do struggle with this, and that I do have an addiction? What if she finds out that I'm, doing this behind her back, and this deep dark secret that I've been hiding for years? What if she finds out? But the outside of me was saying, you're not gonna find anything. I don't do that. Like I said, you don't need to check my phone. Why are you doing this? And she ended up finding something on my phone. I'm not gonna go into detail, of course, what she found, but she found, pornography, and I will never forget the look on her eyes of how much, betrayal she was feeling in that moment. And I'll never forget the way she looked at me when she found that out. She found out, and I remember, being slapped across the face and being yelled at and being, mocked, and, I was just surprised that, I was in shock, basically. I was in shock because I had never thought that someone would ever find out, that on my phone. And the worst part of all this is that it wasn't just this day. This event didn't just end here. What ended up happening was I lied again. I lied to her face. I don't even remember what I said, but I lied to her, wanting her to believe that, oh, that's not me. I didn't do that. I don't. It was really bad. I just came up with lies, lies, more lies. I wasn't being honest, and yet again, I chose to not tell the truth then and there, even though she has evidence. I told to lie again, and she believed it. She believed it for the rest of the day. And the worst part is, I thought that was okay. And so the next day was actually a Sunday, and I remember my pastor going over, he was going over a sermon about how the truth will set you free. And when I was hearing all of it, I was just like, whoa. I was just like, the topic was so, it felt like that topic was speaking to me. I felt like God was using whatever the, pastor was preaching to kind of affect me in a way, because after church, I remember just sitting on my couch, sitting on my couch. I didn't even have my phone on me. I was just sitting on my couch, and I was thinking to myself, do I tell her the truth? Do I be honest with her? Is this God trying to tell me that I should tell the truth about my addiction and what I struggle with? I'd had that little moment, but again, I was living by my flesh. So instead of thinking right there and then that I'm gonna tell her, what I did is I picked up my phone, I went through my whole phone and made sure to delete my tracks, so that again I could lie and not tell the truth. So right then and there, I kind of, in a sense, I just smacked God in the face right there and said, no, I want to do it my way. I think my way is better. So that day we ended up hanging out. But the first thing she asked me when I met up with her, she was like, give me your phone. And I was like, okay, here you go. Now, me knowing that I deleted everything, I'm like, okay, nothing's gonna be found because I deleted everything. I was still a little scared, obviously, because, but I thought I had it. I thought my lie was gonna work, but turns out it didn't. there was more to be found that I didn't even know I had. And, you know, I will never forget the second time as well. The look on her face. It. I was in tears, and so was she. It was just really bad. You know, her finding out a second time after I lied to her face that that wasn't true. So then, obviously, I had no other choice but to tell her the truth. And so I did. I told her that ever since, I was a kid, I was exposed to pornography and it stayed with me. I had an addiction. And that didn't turn out so well. I remember again being pushed, slapped, yelled at, mocked. I was called, names that aren't so nice. You know, and what's even worse is that she wasn't the only one to find out about what I was struggling with. She made me tell my parents. So I had to go face to face with both my parents. I just remember running into the kitchen. Or I remember running into the house, crying. I was so broken and I was so scared and I was like so ashamed of myself. I was so ashamed to be telling my own parents that I was struggling with lust and that I had an addiction to pornography. It was so embarrassing. And not only did my parents know, but she ended up telling her parents. She ended up telling her brothers, her friends, and even telling my own friends too. So everybody knew now. It was no longer a secret. And then I just remembered that day, I didn't know what to do. I was at my lowest. I just remember, her leaving the house, and I took a nap with the last thought in my head is that I do not want to wake up. I don't want to wake up from my nap. I just want to escape and hope this is all just a dream. So from that point on, me and her took a week break. She was deciding whether she wanted to stay with me or not. Obviously I was so disappointed and ashamed of myself, and I wanted to prove myself that, I can defeat this thing that's been, that's been hiding inside of me, and I want to prove to her that that's not me, that's not who I really am. And so what actually happened was we did end up staying in a relationship. I made a promise that I would get better and that I would quit watching that. And, I literally gave her everything. As in, I gave her everything, physically too. I let her have all my passwords, my accounts, my YouTube, my social media, my phone too. I had a parental lock, she put it on there. And I let her do this out of, because I was desperate. I didn't want her to leave me. I wanted to stay in this relationship with her, and I wanted to really prove that I can do this. So I ended up giving her everything. So she has access to basically my whole life now. Because I did it, and I was desperate to stay in that relationship with her because really, I really did love this girl. And as time went by, I started to realize something, As we continued the relationship, that's when I actually started to have a real conversation with God. That's when I started to learn more about God and wanting to learn more about Jesus. because obviously I knew that what I was doing was wrong, and my girlfriend at the time, she stated that she actually didn't forgive me, actually, and that she had no trust in me at all. But she said she'll continue the relationship. And, me knowing that, every day I would kind of doubt myself. I would have thoughts of like, man, what I did was so bad. I would, I would shame myself. And that kind of led me to learn more about Jesus, because I heard that, Jesus is so loving and that he does care about me, and that, he doesn't see me as that. He doesn't see me as a lustful person. He sees me as, his son, his child. And he calls me by my name. And, I just thought, wow, there is someone that does love me. That there is someone that does forgive me. And it's the Creator himself. It's Jesus. It's God. And that's when I kind of started having a real relationship with God, because I started to pray to him and I started to talk to him. I realized I stopped having those thoughts. I stopped having those lustful thoughts. When this all happened, I stopped having those urges to watch pornography and everything. I didn't want to do those things anymore. I didn't want to go and watch pornography anymore. And I was just like, I has to do something with God, And that's why I thought God gave me this girl as a gift to help me defeat lust. And I just embraced it. I embraced that gift. I embraced the relationship that I still had with her, because I honestly thought that, God gave me this girl as a gift. So, as time went on, I got closer with God and everything, and my relationship with him started to strive, which that actually comes up. I wanted to show you guys that I bought a journal during those times. I bought a journal during those times, and I started to journal. I started to write journals, about my everyday life, and I would actually write journals that would kind of act as letters, as if I was writing to God. I would just be writing in times, I'm thankful for this, God. Help me with this, God. I love you, God. I would just be writing letters to him every day, and it was just so beautiful, and I was so at peace during those times. And it was just so nice knowing that God does see this, and that he really does love me, and that I have nothing to be ashamed about, because I put my faith in him. Now, the only problem was, as time went by, the relationship between me and this girl started to deteriorate. The relationship actually got quite worse, as in, we'd actually have frequent arguments, and both of us were just, not slow to anger. It would actually be very easy for one of us to get really upset at something and then argue about it. We also had arguments that weren't important. We were just kind of mad and just arguing. And then another part, which this was, I would say, is the worst part, is that this relationship that I had with this girl also started, to be controlling. The relationship became manipulative and controlling. And what I mean by this is that since I gave everything, I gave my everything to her, she kind of used that as leverage to, kind of for her own benefit. She wouldn't let me go hang out with my friends, and she would only let me if she was there. I couldn't use the bathroom on my own, so I had to, go on call and use the bathroom. And there was just so many other things that, was controlling. She was kind of controlling me in a sense. Like, I remember this one time, or multiple times actually, where whenever we were arguing, I was always put to blame because of what I did originally. She would use her trauma, the trauma that I caused her, to always win an argument, or say it's all my fault, and that I'm the reason, that the reason why she acts like that towards me and does all these things to me. And I didn't really have anything to say about that, because you know she was right at the time. I was thinking, yeah, she is right, that it is all my fault on why she acts like this, and it is all my fault that she's insecure, and it's all my fault that she has trust issues and she doesn't trust me, and it's all my fault. That's literally everything that is the thought that I thought every single day when I woke up, is that it's all my fault. um, and that led to me having symptoms of anxiety, for the first time ever in my life. I never in my life had a time where I was so anxious about something and so depressed about something. You know, I had real symptoms of anxiety and depression, which I'd never thought I ever have, but I did. I had thoughts where I just wanted to go to sleep and never wake up. I just had thoughts, that were very harmful to me. And I thought that if I did something which, you know, is really bad, I thought it would just make everything better. I thought doing something harmful to myself would just make everything better. Um, and so, you know, all of this, with all of the, you know, controlling, the depression, the anxiety, and the sadness that I had still, you know, God was kind of the only one to, you know, help me in those times. Of those times where I'm, judging myself, shaming myself. God was really there to comfort me and tell me that, everything's okay now, and that, He doesn't call me by, those names, those names that actually she used to call me whenever she was mad. Those were very hurtful words. I was really affected by those words, actually. I know they're just words, but I really took those words to heart. And the names and the mocking and all that. But it was good to know that there's a God out there that doesn't call you like that, and it won't treat you like that, and won't call you those names, but instead call you by your name, your real name. He was calling me Levi, my real name. And that was the only thing that kind of kept me through this whole relationship, because I had to deal with all of this for a very long time, up until sophomore year. I dealt with me being controlled and everything, Even though my friends noticed that I wasn't being the person who I was before. They noticed I wasn't really being myself. Even my parents, were involved too. Everyone was worried about me. In a sense, that relationship, I kind of became so stubborn to everybody, because I kind of idolized that relationship in a sense, because I was always with my girlfriend. I was always with her 24/7. I wasn't able to go with my friends, and I never really had family alone time or stuff like that, because I was with her. I was with this girl, you know. All of my time would go to her. And my friends noticed that. My family noticed that. And they thought I wasn't in the right relationship and that this girl isn't for me. But I just know that during those times I was like, you guys don't know what you're talking about. You don't even know her, like. And a part of me did start to realize that, how I was being treated, obviously. There did come a time where I was like, yeah, you guys are kind of right. But the thing is, I still didn't want to end the relationship that I had with this girl, because I was so stubborn, and my heart was so fixated on this girl and just this girl. But then all of the arguments and all of the fights and all of the name calling and the mocking and all those times just built up over time, and that just ended up in me actually leaving the relationship. Um, so this was the last day of school actually, and this was a day before my volleyball tournament, you know, and I had to do certain things for this girl because obviously she was insecure and had trust issues, but I was still all for her obviously, and I'm gonna do these things because every day I still had the goal to prove myself to her. And that day she actually got really, really mad at me. She was screaming. She was yelling on the phone, yelling so loud, like even her own parents heard her from her own room, I'm pretty sure. But she was screaming at me, name calling me, saying like, why the F would you do that? Because this is actually what genuinely happened. What happened was someone threw a piece of candy at me. I don't know who, but I picked it up and I ate it because I thought, well, this is an assembly and, there's gonna be people throwing candy. And so I was like, okay, I'll just eat it. And she got really mad at that because in her mind, she thought, I guess, some girl threw a piece of candy at me, and I don't know, I looked at her or I talked to her, but even though I didn't know who threw the piece of candy at me, her mind was just telling her all these ideas, you know, overthinking. And so she got mad at me because, she was like, why the F would you do that? Why would you pick up a random piece of candy? You don't even know who threw it to you. And I didn't think it was going to be that serious. I didn't even think, she was going to get mad at that. But turns out she got so mad at that. And I ended up, crying a little bit. Um, in the relationship, I was crying from, almost every day. But, I was in the middle of school and I wasn't trying to make a scene and everything like that. So I just kind of let it slide and, I said I'm sorry. But, she was still mad at me the whole day. And then another thing happened which got her even more mad. I was talking to my Spanish teacher. And, you know, she was talking to me about this game that the whole class is gonna play. And I was like, okay, how do you play? And she's telling me da da da. She was making jokes, and then she was like, why are you laughing? And I was like, I was just talking to the teacher, and she was like, she looked at me so disgusted, like I did something really, really wrong. She got mad at me because I was smiling at my teacher, and it got so bad that we just started arguing right then and there in the class, and it was so, that moment right then and there, I was just so mad. Right then in that moment, I was just so mad because, fighting constantly, it just gets so tiring over something that's not even to get mad about. And I finally realized, and I had the courage, and, I really was angry. I was actually really angry. I ended things right then and there on the phone. I was like, I'm done. I don't want this relationship anymore. I don't want to deal with this anymore. And all of a sudden, she's acting like, oh no, I didn't mean that, I'm sorry. All of a sudden, she's not name calling me, but instead asking for forgiveness. And throughout the whole time in the relationship, I was the one to always ask for forgiveness. All the time. Because it was always me doing something wrong. You know what I mean? When I finally ended things with this girl, I felt a weight lift off of my shoulders, and my back. Like I just felt this large weight that I've been carrying for so long. The moment I ended this relationship, all of that just came off. And, I was just so like, wow. I realized that all my friends and my family, what I've been missing out on, And I realized the freedom that I was also missing out on. Because yes, I was, spiritually free from lust and everything. I physically still wasn't free actually. I physically wasn't, I couldn't have any contact with my friends. I didn't really have time to spend with my family. My time was just so set on this one thing that I forgot about everybody. I realized that I forgot about the freedom that, God really offers to everybody in this world. Physical freedom. And that's when I started, that's when everything clicked. the moment I left, that's when everything in my whole entire life clicked. I realized that everything that I experienced and everything that I went through, it was all part of God's plan. Because let's go back to before. My heart was cut off from God. That connection that I had with God, it was cut off because I started rebelling and I didn't repent of my sins. I would always go straight back to, lustful intentions and going back to pornography. I'd always go back to that instead of Jesus, you know. And I realized all this time I was away from God and my heart was away from God the entire time and my heart was hardened. And so he made me go through all of this to soften my heart and make me realize what wrong and how heartbreaking that the things I do is heartbreaking to God. All of these events made me realize my own heart posture and the things that I did, because originally I was blinded by my own sin. I was enslaved by my sin, I wasn't going to Jesus all the time. I was, ignoring him. But since he made me go through all of this, that made my heart soften and made me realize that yes, I am a sinner and that yes, this is all wrong and that I should give all of this up to Jesus. Because ultimately in the relationship, I did experience persecution, Like I said, I experienced the feeling and physically being ashamed. But then again, it's just so powerful to me to know that, God really does love you. All this time I thought that I could do everything on my own. But, again, going through all this made me realize that I can't. Made me realize that I need Jesus. I can't defeat any sin on my own. I can't defeat lust on my own. I constantly need Jesus. And I want to touch upon this again, that since I was away from God, I was actually following Satan in a sense, I can't believe I was following the lies of Satan. Because ultimately what he had me do was climb up a big giant ladder just for me to fall down hard. And that's what happened, right? God allowed that to happen, for me to climb such a big ladder of pride and lust, and then for to fall down off of that large ladder. He allowed all of that to happen to realize that God was telling me that I should come to him. And that's when I did. When I ended things, I realized all this and I gave my life 100%. I gave all of my heart to Christ. And I really did pray to him and tell him how thankful I was. And the last thing off of this testimony is I want to share a journal that I wrote a few days after I broke up with this girl, which I think truly shows how I felt and how it was just so surreal. I just want to read it to you guys. This was Monday, March 30th at 11:42 p.m. I wrote, "I believe you have a plan for me, Lord. I know I could be wrong, but what I think the Lord is wanting me to do is really listen to what my parents are telling me, such as not getting a girlfriend. I feel like God used this girl to really teach me a lesson about my sin and the relationship I had with Christ back then. I know that I struggled with lust back then, and anything I did could not defeat it. I'm just remembering the day she found out. I believe God wanted me to feel the guilt of sin and truly defeat lust. Even though I am not with this girl anymore, I still care about her. I pray for her well-being and relationship with Jesus. But also I noticed that after I was baptized, that's when she found out. What I learned through my relationship with this girl is that, in general, I don't need a girlfriend figure right now, because I feel like I should be more appreciative of God's love, and ultimately, God fills that love spot for me. I know nobody in this world can give me the love the same way the Lord does." Praise the Lord. Thank you for listening to my testimony. Just remember, Jesus loves you, and He has a plan for you, and He cares about you so much, and He will call you by your name no matter how big your sin is. He loves you so much. Jesus loves you. God bless everybody.